They took Elisa before dawn, quiet as a drawer being pulled shut. One moment the little body was warm against Luia's breast, the next there were hands in the doorway, and the smell of tobacco and coin. The baby was wrapped once, twice. The hand that lifted her did not hesitate. There was no bargaining long enough for a woman's grief. The sale was a small, terrible thing done cleanly, as if cleanliness could hide the transaction of flesh. The enginho woke like every other morning. A slow light over the cane, dew boiling off the leaves, the thin smoke from the cookhouses blurring the horizon. From the Casa Grande there came the soft clack of silver trays and the high voice of the Senhora calling the names of those she owned, as if naming them might keep them still. From the Senzala there was the low unthreading of sleep, people pushing themselves up from boards rubbed smooth by generations of bodies, the shuffle of bare feet, the smell of milk and cassava porridge. The world was split along a straight line of steps and a gate, one side linen and lique, the other wood and the constant small economies of care. Luia had known the weight of absence before, but not this shape. Elisa's head had been small enough to fit in the curve of her arm, a curl of hair that smelled of milk. Mothers in the Senzala learned to count breaths at night, to measure a life by the steadiness of chest against chest. When the hands took Elisa, Luia's counting stopped. Time became a single held note. Men who had spoken in jokes grew quiet. Women who had been braiding hair let the threads fall. Joaquina put the lid back on the pot as if heat could be paused. Even the capataz's dogs seemed to sense a change in the air. It was not only the loss that moved them, it was the contempt threaded through the act. The Senhora did not come herself. She sent paper in folded sums, a man who said the child would be better placed, that a house of a certain standing required children of a certain make. The legalities of ownership had a way of making terrible things official. But what lingered most in the Senzala was the imaging of that house. Velvet cushions, lace-curtained windows, a fan that never tired, a woman who could order a human life like a sugar measured into a cup. People in the Senzala do not let a name die easily. Names are stitches against erasure. They stood in a circle later that day, elbows close, voices low as they retied what the morning had tried to snatch away. Songs slipped between them, murmured pieces so old that no one claimed their authorship, and with those songs came the small shared histories that become law in the absence of courts. "Keep her name," Luia said, voice rough as stripped bark. "We will speak it. We will not let her be folded into a paper where she is only a price." Joaquina, older by a handful of winters and scarred by the shape of authority, put her palm over Luia's. Her touch was a kind of geography, routes memorized, a map of where to step and where not to look. "We speak," she said, "and we act, but we do not throw our children into the fire of the Señor's revenge for the sake of our rage." Her voice was steady, and people leaned into that steadiness as if it were a post against a storm. They did not speak at once of retribution. The Senzala's talk turned first to a more practical litany, the small comforts that would keep a woman sane, the frayed cloth that would be sewn into a keepsake. Who would take in Luia's few things, how to keep a hole of bread by the fire so she would not faint when the sun exposed her bare head. Those are the first resistances, to tend to grief with hands that know how to make things whole again. Benedito came at dusk the next market day, his cart laden with the sort of wares that made Senhoras smile, spices wrapped neat, bolts of fabric, little glass bottles that caught the light. Men like him made their living by being useful to both sides. He had an ambiguous face, neither cruel like the capataz, nor soft like those who give without thought. He had been a friend to some in the Senzala, before mercantile necessity turned some dealings into sharp edges. Still, people watched him when he stepped down from his cart, because where a trader's gaze lingered could mean favor or trouble. Benedito left a small parcel with Joaquina, wrapped in oilcloth. "For the baby," he said, voice low. He did not stay to be thanked. He could not stay. The frasco, the bottle, was nothing like the gilt that the Senhora hoarded. It was a plain glass vial that rattled faintly when turned. No one in the Senzala asked outright what it contained. It was enough that Benedito had chosen and chosen to give. In places like the enginho, gifts are never simply that. They are messages couched in sugar, currency disguised as compassion. Luia held the frasco as if it were a talisman, cradling it against her chest the way she had held Elisa. She did not know if the bottle contained medicine or merely colored water, if it could change the fact that a child had been sold. She felt each possibility like a tide, hope small, wild, almost foolish, the hard ballast of anger, the steady ache of mourning. At night she pressed the glass into her palm and told the empty room the names of things she wanted to be true. Memory, she knew, could act as a kind of inoculation against erasure. To say a name was to make the thing itself resist being folded into ledger books. The life after loss reorganized itself into signals. A cloth hung from the rafters in a certain way meant to remind one another of the day to fetch water. The sound of a pot lid knocked 3 times from inside a hut meant danger had been seen. People read one another by gestures, a hand smoothing a skirt, a barefoot drawing a line in the dirt. Those small languages proliferated because speech could be treacherous. The capataz had ears everywhere. The Senhor and the Senhora had reason to think they owned silence as much as they owned bodies. There was debate, too. Some said, take what you can and leave the place. Go to the hills and live with the quilombo. There is safety there, at least in numbers. Others argued that leaving meant abandoning the children still held a few doors away, saying nothing about the wrongs that would continue to be done in the same light. Joaquina listened to both with the practiced patience of someone who had learned to be a ledger for other people's debts. We will look for shelter, she said, but leaving is not the only course. We are not property to be moved at someone's whim. We must make them see us not as things but as people, but as... The plan formed slowly, like a stitch line drawn inch by inch. First, reconnaissance, the mapping of the Casa Grande's routines. Who came through the morning gates? When did the Senhor take his siesta, and when did servants carry the dishes back? Where were the windows that looked into the courtyard and which ones faced the plantation? Capataz João Inácio's footprints and habits were read like a calendar. He liked the west stairs at 7 and the east steps at noon. He favored discipline at dusk because that was when fatigue made bodies speak too plainly. Luia learned these things as if learning the contours of a keepsake. She memorized windows and hinges, the frequency of the guards' rounds. She learned the scent of the Senhora's linen, delicate, a perfume that hovered like the tail of a song. She learned where the leque lived when it was not in the Senhora's hand, and how servants carried trays in single file. Learning was an act of accumulation, and accumulations become instruments. They did not decide quickly to confront the Senhora in the Casa Grande. That decision grew from layered grievances and the smoldering logic of people who had tried everything else. There were moments in the Senzala councils when someone would propose a direct act, something that would force the ruling house to see them, and the room would split into constellations, those who thought such an act would bring ruin, those who believed shame could be a weapon sharp enough to cut through complacency. Shame, Joaquina said once, as if testing the word, is a kind of rope. It binds people to their better selves when used right, or it snaps and hurts you. Luia's grief was a geography she walked every hour. The kitchen where she had fed Elisa, the board bench where she had sung lullabies, the place by the fire where other mothers had sat with her and spoken of the child in 1,000 protective ways. Into that grief slipped a question. Who would make the Senhor feel the absence of Elisa in a way the ledger books could not measure? Money could not be the only language left in the world. They spoke late into the nights, moving their plans through music and metaphor so that the idea would remain something they could claim without spelling it for the capataz. In the heart of that discussion came the image that would become the plan's center, to force the Senhora into the Senzala, to make her move through the long space where she had never been meant to step, to make her see what she pretended never existed. It would not be an act of savage revenge, it would be a public inversion, a way to show, without touching the Senhora more than necessary, the human faces she had ordered like a menu. The plan's aim was to rupture a veneer of civility, so brittle it would scatter into words. So the neighboring towns, the markets, the parish, could not unsee the harm. The idea unsettled some. It thrilled others. In a council meeting that stretched past midnight, elders of the Senzala argued with mothers and younger men and a few cunning youths who had run market errands and knew the rhythms beyond the enginho. Some feared that forcing the Senhora's passage would invite brutal retaliation. Whippings, new sails, a sweep that would tilt their fragile worlds into ruin. Others pointed out that the Senhora's reputation was one of her few remaining weapons. To blunt that was to change the calculus of dominance. If the market in the town began to whisper of the Senhora, who had been marched through the Senzala, the way the parish priest whispered when he kept his sermons bland would change as well. Reputation, they said, was a long road of power. If you could alter that road's stones, you might change the journey for many to come. The elders of the Quilombo were mentioned as a refuge if things went badly. Their names were spoken with the respect of those who had seen organized runaways take shape into communities where fugitives made new polities. The Quilombo elders offered counsel in songs and proverbs. When the mountain takes a stand, it does not shout, the elders would say, according to the stories Luia had heard. It rearranges the water. That measured voice gave the plan a second life. It was not mere reactionary fury, but a strategy anchored in the knowledge of how to live otherwise. Yet even with counsel there were moral tensions. Why humiliate a woman who, privately, might never have touched the selling ledger? Why choose public shame as weapon rather than theft of something owned? The argument returned, and the Senzala had to reckon with the truth that their acts would not be neat. They were not performing righteousness. They were making a kind of law where the law did not exist for them. That law would cost them. They named that cost aloud and then prepared to weigh it. Benedito's next visit brought more than spices. He negotiated in the corner of the courtyard with a servant who had known too many secrets and with faces that spoke in the sideways grammar of bribery and necessity. He left behind a rumpled shawl and a note that said simply, "If you must, do it in a way that keeps the heart alive." No one pressed him. His gesture was at once clear and ambiguous, like all things born in commerce. In the bottle he brought there were, some said, tinctures that could calm a child's fever or ease an adult's pain. Others swore it was only color and men's soft talk. The truth of the frasco mattered less than what it stood for, possibility, a thing passed from outsider to the vulnerable, in a world that would rather accord no rights to such people. Luia slept less and dreamt more. In her dreams, Elisa's hands were full of sugarcane, clumsy at first, then deft. She saw the child older, taller, running on the edges of a quilombo field where other children chased a goat. The dreams offered no certainties. They were made of desire, and the raw material of what could be remembered, even when memory is under threat. She kissed the frasco each morning and tucked a scrap of cloth, Elisa's first apron, inside her skirt like a relic. There were practical skills to be gained as well. The plan required more than courage. It demanded the dexterity of those who could navigate the night without making a sound. Young men whose tasks had always been to carry grain learned to step on board so old they would not complain. Women who had ironed linen for the Senhora learned to fold and bend in ways that made them appear invisible to a passing lantern. Even the children had roles. To make a noise in a distant shed when the timing was right, to plant old gossip in the mouths of servants, so attention would go elsewhere. Capataz Juan Ignacio was not a simple villain in Luia's mind. He was a man whose life had been made thin by responsibilities he had never chosen. He liked neat rows of sugar and neat rows of men, and measured his worth by the order he kept. He had a quick temper and he held grudges, but he was not immune to conversation. There were nights when João Ignacio would sit on the steps and listen as if the hum of the Senzala might ease the ache of his own small losses. The plan had to account for his moments of grace as well as his moments of cruelty, because men like him could be the hinge between safety and disaster. On a windless night when the moon had lost interest in the clouds, the Senzala held another meeting. The air was thick with the smell of boiled cassava and linen left to dry. Some had sewn small flags inside the hems of skirts as signals. A black shawl would mean hold, a white cloth would mean go. They had counted the footsteps of the guards and rehearsed routes until they could name them in their sleep. Luia felt the plan like a seam about to be stitched, precise and irrevocable. Joaquina spoke last. She had the cadence of someone who had buried children and loved them onward, who had known the slow, patient work of building. "We will not make the Senhora bleed," she said. "We will make her look. We will make her feel a portion of what she purchases as a thing feels, the indignity of being reduced. It will be a crossing. We will not break her body. We will unmake the notion that some people are outside the reach of our humanity. The room held its breath. In the corner an old woman hummed a lullaby. Luia thought of Elisa's tiny fist and felt her throat tighten until the air was a cord. Plans always have hinges. In theirs, one hinge was the market day when many servants left, and a visiting merchant would distract the household. Another hinge was a servant's loyalty, a woman named Rosa, who had been servant to the Senhora for years, who watched more than she reported. Rosa had her reasons, a brother in a distant Quilombo, a memory of kindness from Joaquina when Rosa had been a child with holes in her shoes. Rosa had learned to wear the appropriate face for the Casa Grande and to keep a different face for the kitchen's shadows. She agreed to leave a door ajar at a precise hour if the Senhora took a particular turn down the corridor. That turn would be the invitation. On the night chosen, the air tasted metallic with the promise of rain. Luia wrapped the frasco inside her shift and pressed it to her heart. The bottle's glass warmed against her skin like a small light. Around her, people moved like a low current, silent, purposeful. They had planned not only the act, but also the exits. If the worst happened, they would scatter toward known safe houses, toward the river willows where a canoe might wait, toward the paths that led to the Quilombo elders who had offered counsel and shelter. Escape routes were part of the morality of the act. To risk without a plan of refuge would be despair, not resistance. As they moved, the Senzala itself seemed to change underfoot. The boards creaked in familiar places and were soundless in others. Children who would later claim they were only playing were used as signals, whispers that would mean a change in the plan. The night smelled of crushed cane and the faint smoke from the Casa Grande's cookhouse. In the distance, a dog barked. Someone laughed too loudly. A tray fell and clattered, and people flinched into their places. Luia's heart beat in counterpoint to the plan. In the brief seconds walking to the edge of the Casa Grande's courtyard, she underwent 100 small reckonings. Had she thought through the consequences for others? Had she counted the possibility that a child of someone else might be sold as punishment? Could a symbolic act be forged without bringing blood to the body of the Senzala? These were not the thoughts of cowards, but of people who had long lived under the shadow of finality. Courage, she had learned, is often the capacity to accept the cost of an action when you do not like the bill. Lights shone from the windows of the Casa Grande, soft squares in the large dark of the yard. A servant moved in a lantern's halo, setting a bowl down on a side table. The Senhora's silhouette was sometimes seen at a window, like a cut-out paper figure. Elegant, unaware of all that the night stitched in the world outside. There were small rituals before any action. People touched the soil where their ancestors had walked. An elder, Luia's mother, who had left the Quilombo for a time and come back with eyes that had seen both refuge and the need to survive, pressed Luia's hand and said, "Say her name. When you speak her name, you give her a spot in the world no law can take." Luia did. "Elisa," she whispered, the name rolling into the dark like a pebble into still water. It made a sound that was simple and necessary. They moved to the outer edge of the courtyard. A servant left the side door ajar, just as Rosa had agreed to do. The servants' faces were brief flashes of light and uncertain allegiances. Luia thought of the Senhora's like, and how often that like had traced dismissals in the air above their heads. Tonight, the like would be the symbol to unmask. They would pluck it from its place in a gesture that would be more humiliation than harm. To be unmade in front of those you had thought yourself above, that was the point. Stepping into the Casa Grande the first time felt like walking into someone else's dream that had been cared for too nicely. Carpets smelled of oils. A painting looked down at them with a face that had never been asked for anything and therefore had never been taught to see please. The servants glanced toward the hallway and then away. Luia breathed in air that tasted of lamp oil and the faint dust of years. Her hands were steady, the frasco pressed against her ribs like a small urgent animal. At the threshold a noise. A tray clattered far down the corridor. The household stirred. Someone whispered the Senhora's name, an alarmed syllable. It moved faster through the house than any planned step. Luia felt the plan's fragile architecture morph into the chaos of living. People do not always behave as rehearsed. Hearts miscount. Steps are misread. It is in those moments when script and life diverge that choices reveal their moral shape. They had decided this would not be a moment for speeches. The Senhora would be taken with as little violence as possible and made to cross the long line of boards that held the Senzala's bodies. The intention was to force sight upon the woman who had lived in a room above the heads of those whose labor kept her house. The moment would be theatrical, certainly, but not merely performative. It would be a moral exposure. If the Senhora trembled, it would not be from blows, but from the sudden, raw recognition of what she had done. If the servants gasped, it would be because something named truth had arrived in their clean hallways. As they guided the Senhora, a movement orchestrated like a dark pageant, as gentle as their fear allowed, Luia's mind flickered to the ledger entries that had once counted Elisa as a price. The paper's flatness had been able to hold the brutal arithmetic of property. That night, curious hands would unravel a page's worth of claims and lay them down beside human faces and names. It was a reversal designed to show the ledger's poverty when weighed against a beating chest. And then, as their small group prepared to cross the courtyard with the Senhora between them, words came. Not from the Senhora, but from another angle. A carriage wheel scraped. A voice called the Senhor's name. The household shifted. The capataz, perhaps sensing an imbalance, stepped toward the threshold. Light pooled and shrank like an animal wounded. Luia felt the plan teeter. The edge of the action where courage becomes catastrophe is a narrow seam. It is always possible to fold fear into prudence and call it sense. It is also possible to name prudence as cowardice if one lets the ledger of losses weigh too heavily. She thought of Elisa again. Fingers, laugh that had not yet learned the shape of the world, and the feeling was neither clear victory nor surrender. It was an ache that tasted like metal. At that instant, a child's laugh bubbled from the Senzala far behind them, and as if at the shift of a chord, all the careful work in the house moved at a new pace. A servant, seeing the disruption, shut the door a fraction too late. The world did what worlds often do. It refused to be neat. They had one chance left, a motion, a step, a choice made in the space between breath and breath. Luia squeezed the frasco and felt cold glass under her palm. Behind her, Joaquina touched her arm like an anchor. They stepped forward. If history were a neat ledger, this is the place to record outcomes cleanly. But here memory insists on ambiguity. What followed that crossing would be remembered in fragments. A leke dropped as if time had been cut, the Senhora's skirts brushed by hands that had known only mop and dish. The low, incredulous sound a woman makes when she recognizes she has been made visible to those she preferred invisible. There were tears and there were doors slammed. There was noise and then a long, thick silence as townspeople told the rumor and the rumor walked out into the market. But the story of that crossing did not end in a single night. Reprisals were planned. The capataz's fury had a currency as well. They would come, the elders warned, with punishment, with new sales as deterrent, with the kind of cruelty that measures itself by the breadth of fear it can draw across a field. Even as the plan achieved its immediate aim, making the Senhora cross a line she had never crossed and feel for a beating second the faces she had bought, there was the accounting to do. Who would bear the punishment? Where would Luia and those most compromised seek shelter? What of Elisa, who remained indefinido in their collective memory? They had prepared for flight. The Quilombo elders had promised a route if necessary, a patchwork of safe houses and hidden paths that opened like a fan into the hills. The moral weight of the act did not lighten with the plan's execution. It simply transformed, becoming a different kind of responsibility. To survive the day after the exposure, to hold tight to the names that would need to be sung, to ensure that Elisa's absence did not become a ledger entry in the mind of history. Luia ran then not away from the house, but toward the place they had promised themselves as solace. The sense of hearing changed, the sound of her own breath, faster now, the rustle of skirts, the faint, awful scream of a dog. Behind her, the portico's light flickered and the world of the Casa Grande reassembled itself into order, as if order could be summoned by a sweep of a hand. But order now had a crack in it, and cracks let rumor and truth seep where they had not before. They reached the river's edge where, in the hush after action, the small boat waited. Faces around her were pale and taut. Some wore the look of people who had been given a hard truth and decided to accept the consequences with a kind of defiant knowing. The Quilombo's path opened like a throat. To flee was not to deny the event, but to extend its life in safety, so the story might be told and retold, so the name Elisa would be kept more than ledger could allow. In the days that followed, news braided itself into other conversations. The market merchant who whispered of a Senhora who had been marched through the Senzala. A priest who cleared his throat more than usual when he spoke from the pulpit. The Senhor who sought to repair a reputation by issuing alms, whose generosity smelled of guilt. Reprisals did come. A few lashes, a new sale concluded with a different kind of efficiency, the capataz's face drawn like paper. But alongside punishment, there was also something the system could not easily buy back: talk. People in neighboring towns began to speak the names of the enslaved, not as property, but as persons with histories. A rumor travels like seed. Once it settles, it grows. Luia would live the rest of her life under the knowledge that a single act had both taken and given. She had stolen nothing by the law, but had shifted the ledger of moral accounting in a way that might, in time, be read differently. In the Quilombo, elders told the tale in low voices that were equal parts warning and song. They praised the courage and counted the costs. There were nights when fear quieted the story, and nights when it grew like a fire stoked by talk and the insistence to remember. She never, to her knowledge, found Elisa again. The question of the child's fate remained a hollow in her life that could never be neatly filled. In the stories that later anchored themselves to the enginho's legend, people would say that Elisa's fate was indefinido, one of those truths the community could not settle without papers, and those in power refused to open. The uncertainty did not erase the act or its meaning. If anything, it enlarged the moral urgency. To say a life is unaccounted is to say that history needs to be read against the ledger. Years later, when Luia would be older, and the name Elisa was a word she kept folded into her speech like a secret, she would sometimes sit by a river and let the current pass through her hands. She would feel the frasco warm in its place in her memory, and would hum the hymn that the Senzala had made for the child. Friends and foes had long been remade into less tidy categories. Some of the servants who had once been complicit had gone on to speak to strangers about what they had witnessed. The Senhora's reputation was never quite the same. The cracks showed when people went to her house to put out good word, and the servants' faces refused smoothness. The act had not ended slavery. It could not. But it had altered speech. In markets they no longer named all things with the same carefree pronouncement. People at the church doors would pass one another with questions like stones waiting to be thrown. The ripples travelled like water finding new beds, softening but not erasing the boundaries that had once seemed so absolute. The memory of that night became a kind of folk scripture, a cautionary tale, a hymn, an argument for those who would stand. People would speak of the Senhora's crossing in tones that were sometimes awed, sometimes angry, sometimes shorn of sentiment. Their mouths turned the story into different things as the need required. For Luia, memory was not simply history to be recited. It was a presence that warmed and cut. It kept Elisa alive in a way that rules could not. And yet, there was always the cost to reckon. Families were split further. The capataz found new ways to punish. The Senhor bought new loyalties with coins that came with a price none could easily name. The community paid attention to this ledger as well, learning to account for suffering in ways that did not glorify pain, but acknowledged it as part of the necessary and almost impossible work of refusing erasure. They told the children to speak names, not numbers, and to remember that an act done in the dark might shine in the market's light. If you listen to the old ones now, they will tell you that the crossing was an act of reclaiming, a hand extended to call the world to see. They will tell you also that there were nights of somber silence after, when the people counted those taken and those left, when they tended wounds and stitched new lines into their quilts. The moral was never tidy. There are no endings that wash away consequence. There is only the continuing account, balanced in the infinitesimal marks of a society learning to live with the truth that some laws were made to hide injustice. If this story stirs something in you, if the memory of Elisa or the courage of the Senzala calls to you, subscribe to hear other songs and stories carried from places where memory resists being bought. Your ear is part of the work of remembering. They waited in the Quilombo long enough for rain to wash traces from the road. Elders spoke in low tones about how stories become instruction, telling the tale so young ears might know there are other ways to measure a life. Luia kept her hands busy in the tasks of the refuge, teaching others the small arts of survival, how to sew a flag into a hem as signal, how to fold a cloth so that it might hold a letter, how to speak a name so it endures. And yet the world beyond did not remain quiet. The Senhor sought to repair his house's broken dignity with a public show, a paid mass, gifts distributed to the poor, whose poverty was in no way linked to the systems of ache that had been revealed. He sent emissaries to the local magistrate insisting that order be restored and that those responsible be punished. Reprisals were promised and, in small, cruel doses, enacted. In the quiet of a later afternoon, Luia stood on a ridge above the cane fields and let the wind carry the dust. She felt the life of the land, the stretch of green that fed the Casa Grande and the Senzala, the same wind over both places. And she thought of how intimately enmeshed those lives were. For a long time she had wanted only a single thing, to touch Elisa's hair once more. She had never been able to know whether that wish was a cruel vanity or a necessary insistence. The desire remained uncompromised by time. On that ridge she held the frasco one last time, feeling its glass like a small heart. She had smuggled it out hidden in a bundle. In a community like theirs, relics are kept as proof. She had no illusions about victory. She had learned the hard arithmetic. Every act of resistance would ask for payment. She counted the cost in faces and in nights, and in the quiet moments when the children asked questions about who had been taken and why adults' voices tightened. At the edge of the Quilombo's cleared land, a woman sat with a child on her knee and sang, and Luia joined. The song was about names, about saying them 3 times in the night, about sewing them into cloth, about the way calling aloud makes a thing less likely to be forgotten. Memory, Luia had discovered, is not a passive thing. It is an active keeping. It is work, and it asks for more than mourning. It asks for action, even imperfect action, when law has been absent. When the rain came that night, it was not a forgiveness. It was a washing that made footprints less legible and allowed the Quilombo to breathe. They spoke in the dim light about next steps, about ways to spread the story that might protect others without inviting ruin. They argued over the ethics of further acts of exposure, over whether the street talk in neighboring towns had done more to shame the Senhora than any legal action could. Some thought the hills should hold them in silence. Others wanted the story told in markets and taverns, far beyond the plantation's shadow. Luia listened, the frasco cradled like a lit prayer. She felt the shape of the world shifting under her feet. Small moves, hardly noticeable but persistent. She understood then that their crossing had been but one tile in a long mosaic. It had broken the surface. Now they would see whether the cracks could grow into fault lines, or whether the house would simply patch over and continue. At dusk, she walked to the place where the children played. A boy with dirt on his knees asked her without great thought, was it right? He had not meant to ask such a heavy question. He merely wanted to know the measuring of the world. Luia crouched and looked him in the face. I do not know, she said. Sometimes what we must do and what is right are different. We must do what keeps us human. He thought for a moment and nodded as if satisfied by the answer's honesty. That is the kind of teaching that endures, not an assurance of clean victory, but a recognition of cost and the willingness to keep memory alive. They would send word back to the Senzala to hold certain songs, to keep the name Elisa in every lullaby. They would instruct the market runners to tell the story without embellishment, to let speech be the courthouse where many small witnesses could speak the truth. They would think also of other acts, less dramatic but perhaps equally vital. Leaving a rent of bread by the door of those who had been most threatened, helping children learn to read the cursive of ledgers so one day they might write themselves into histories no longer dictated by owners. Luia thought of the Senhora sometimes, as one might think of a storm that had passed but left a landscape altered. She was not a monster in Luia's mind, but a being made complicit by a system that taught her to consider people objects. To change that system would require changing not just deeds but imaginations, what people could conceive of when they looked at another human being. That is why the act in the Casa Grande had targeted sight and the public square. It was less the humiliating of a body than the exposure of a mind. As night folded in, Luia sat by the fire and drew the frasco from inside her shirt. She turned it and listened to the small rattle of something within, and within that sound there was a part of the plan that could be unmade and remade. The bottle was a witness, not a talisman of victory. They had done a thing that could not be undone, and had opened possibilities that might be dangerous and might be liberating. It was the work of a people to decide what to carry forward. The next steps, as they understood them, would not be taken in a single night. They would be the slow labor of changing the ways folks spoke, of teaching children names instead of numbers, of building futures in the Colombo, and making sure that memory lived in the songs of market women and the prayers of quiet parishioners. They had shifted the surface. They would have to continue shifting the ground. When the moon rose full over the cane and the Quilombo, Luia wrapped the frasco and placed it into a small pouch she wore around her neck, then let herself think of Elisa one more time. When the moon rose full over the cane and the Quilombo, Luia wrapped the frasco and placed it into a small pouch she wore around her neck, then let herself think of Elisa one more time. She slept in fits and starts beneath the sheltering arms of women who had learned to sleep with one ear open. Dreams braided with waking, a child's laugh, the rustle of a dress, the ledger's thin white edge. Dawn came, and with it the quiet work of mending, of making places for a life that remained unnamed in the town's books. Word of the night travelled in the crooked ways words always do, by the foot that raced to the market and the maid who could never keep a face smooth. Yet what spread next was worse. Children were dying in the surrounding estates, fevers that might have been eased with simple things, salts, herbs, the tonic, some call medicine, having been denied, miscounted, or ignored. The newspapers of rumour carried no ledger of cause. The market placed no blame. People said the deaths were small and private, the sort of detail easily absorbed into the dust. But when one family's child dies and another's neighbour says the same, the quiet becomes a drum. In the Quilombo, the elders had already known how scarcity bent toward cruelty. They had traced how a household's economy could turn into a calculus of which bodies merited care. Some of the illnesses were old-fashioned, coughs that hardened into chest shadows, fevers that curled a child into itself. Some spoke of a medicine bottle locked away in a chest because the Senhora believed saving the finest tinctures for those of the house would preserve value. Whether that was precisely true for every death, no one could say with paper-sure proof. Whether it was the way people in power chose to value lives, everyone could see. It was this pattern, of small deaths layered until they looked like a design, that hardened the resolve of some who had watched their own children sold or sent away. The act in the Casa Grande had been an answer to one ledger. Now it became an answer to many quiet lists. People counted not only the losses they knew, but the ones they feared. If a woman with money could choose who lived and who was folded into a list, then visibility itself had become a form of protection. When the Senhora was forced through the Senzala, a passage she would later call a humiliation, a wrong, a phrase she used to summon pity from the gentry, the memory that stitched itself into the town's talk was more than the sight of a woman out of place. It was the way her skirts brushed the boards so often swept by hands that had no right to leisure, the way the scent of her linen, once a mist of perfumes, mingled with smoke and cassava and the oil of human skin. They moved her forward, as if conducting a reluctant visitor through a house of mirrors that showed her what she had been buying and how little it had preserved. The group that accompanied her had never wanted a brutish spectacle. There were rules set in the dim meetings. No mutilation, no obscene gesture meant to degrade beyond recognition, no theft timed to leave a child with scars that could not be tended. They wanted a single terrible inversion, the Senhora made to wander where she had ordered people to hide. Hands on her arms were firm but careful. The point was to expose, not to break. Still, the sensation of being led became in itself a force. It turned the customary power of the house inside out. Servants peered from corners, some with eyes wide, some with the look of people who had already been counting the cost. A child, hidden behind a post, thought the scene a strange pageant. The Senhora's face, once painted with composed command, changed. Her voice faltered. She called for the Senhor. She could not understand why the world had been rearranged. For the town beyond the walls, the story was a scandal and a mirror. At the market, women spoke and then lowered their voices. At the church door, men paused in ways that suggested their conscience had been aroused, or at least their curiosity. The Senhor tried to fix things with charity, donations, a public mass, almsgiving calculated to buy back a calm that had already developed a crack. Those gestures were visible, but hollow to eyes that had watched children turned away from medicine. The real change was less immediate. A whisper here and there that the Senhora could no longer command speech as lubriciously as before. Reputation, that porous currency of social life, had been nicked. Gossip became pressure. Reprisals arrived in the forms older hands had feared. Capataz João Inácio, whose life was ordered by the rows he kept and the punishments he doled, tightened his grip. A couple of men suspected of leading the household action were seized and beaten in the yard. Whippings not described in close detail, but the knowledge of their occurrence spooling through the Senzala like a warning. 2 young families found themselves hastily told that one child would be sold to settle debts incurred in the wake of disorder. Accounts were made and made official. The Senhor sent letters to magistrates and to merchants, polishing the language of injury. He paid the parish for quiet sermons and in small ceremonies placed bread on tables to show that order was being restored. These punishments did not smother the story. If anything, they made it more complicated. When a child was sold as a reprisal, the Quilombo elders counted that sale as part of the bill for any single act. They spoke plainly to Luia and her companions. Every act makes debts. The world will ask payment. That was not an argument to stop. It was a ledger meant to be read honestly. For the Quilombo, protecting those who acted was part of the cost. They widened the net of refuge, set up contingencies of shelter, and taught people to carry names as armor. In council, long after the night when the Senhora had felt the boards beneath unfamiliar feet, the Quilombo debated the ethics of their strategy. Some argued for further acts of public exposure in other houses, small targeted embarrassments meant to lay bare the industry of buying bodies. Others counseled restraint, pointing out how the capataz had retaliated with efficiency and how the market's attention could burn away their safety. The elders favored stories and instruction, teach children to speak names, train those who could read in the ways ledgers worked, and step into markets with speech rather than with force. The moral point was never settled by applause. It was passed like a coin around the circle, heavy to hold and requiring sober counting. Luia heard these debates and felt their truth like a stone underfoot. She had not imagined herself a martyr or a leader. She had imagined once only a small hand in hers. Now she found herself a seam in a community pushed toward decision. Her grief had become something that others measured in different ways. Allies came to her, their faces carved with new lines. Rosa, the servant who had risked her Lusa station to leave a door ajar. Benedito, the trader, who had a new reason now to be careful when his cart rolled into town. Joaquina watched her with an eye that weighed history and the present against one another, and Luia learned from that gaze how a plan's moral claim must survive not only its execution, but its aftermath. There were other quieter ripples. A schoolteacher in a neighboring village, newly returned from months away, began teaching a class of children to read using simple ledgers and stories. The idea was radical only by the smallness of its means. Women in market stalls began to call one another by the names they were given, refusing the habit of speaking about the hands or the people as if flesh had no name. Priests could not all be relied upon to reform, but some found their sermons changing, turning from abstract exhortation to something that nudged at conscience. These changes were slow and uneven. They did not make up for a child's death, nor did they erase the fear of sale. In private, after the worst of the immediate danger had passed, the Senhor and Senhora tried to reconstruct their world. They paid for the restoration of a garden, they commissioned a portrait that would show them as benevolent, and they sealed certain medicines back in lockboxes labeled with polite writs. To the town, the gesture was meant as closure. To the Quilombo, it was a sign the house chose to mend its surface, rather than to address the rot beneath. More arms, fewer admissions. Luia learned of these moves at the same time she learned of the things that could not be mended by money. A mother in a neighboring estate who had been denied a tonic for her fevered infant died, and the news came into the Quilombo not as a ledger entry, but as a raw pain in the chest. When grief meets prudence, decisions get heavier. The Quilombo elders put that child's name alongside Elisa's in songs and in lists when they prayed at dusk. There was no rescue for every child. There were only ways to make the world notice and sometimes act. The frasco, simple and worn at Luia's neck, remained a private relic. People asked sometimes what was inside. She would say, "Hope and worry," and the answer satisfied them, as if a charm had been given back instead of medicine. Once, in a council where words were heavy and the moon hung low, she opened the pouch and let the bottle rattle its small sound. An elder took it reverently and said, "We keep this not because it heals all wounds, but because it tells a story that will not fit into a ledger." The group nodded. Memory, the elder said, is a kind of medicine too, slower, less certain, but perhaps more wide-reaching. Time did not unmake the fear or the loss, but it softened some edges. Luia found herself teaching children to sew names into hems, watching them press their fingers into cloth as if embossing an identity. Children in the Quilombo learned lullabies that said the names of those who had been taken. The songs folded names into rhythm, so the young mouths could not forget. The act of saying a name thrice in the night was both ritual and weapon. Ritual in the quiet of grief, weapon in the way it refused to be economized. People who had watched the Casa Grande's crossing later argued about whether it had saved lives. Some insisted that public shame had forced the Senhor to make medicines more accessible, for fear his reputation would otherwise be ruined. Others said the small acts of relief he gave were tea-time gestures designed to soothe gossip, but not to change the underlying economy of ownership. Evidence for either view was messy. A shopkeeper at the next town, who bought wine from the Senhor's agent, claimed that orders were smaller and more selective in the months that followed. A mother in a village claimed a neighbor had been offered a tincture and then told it was not for their sort. The truth lived in these dissonances. Luia felt both vindication and sorrow. When someone in the Quilombo said that the crossing had saved children, she looked at the line of small faces and could not claim the moral certainty they sought. When someone claimed it had only made the Senhor more careful at appearances, she could not deny the harsh reprisal of sales that had followed. The ledger, she knew, would never balance neatly. Lives had been altered in ways that no act could tally. Years passed. The Senhora lived, adjusted, and retreated into a life gilded with smaller comforts. The reputation wound she had acquired showed in the faces of those who came to her home, some embarrassed, some solicitous. The Senhor died not long after, leaving a will that was less revolutionary than people hoped. The Quilombo persisted, its children growing into adults who could read a simple list and understood how to say a name. Benedito grew older and more careful with whom he traded. Rosa vanished for a while and then reappeared, carrying news from other places that had become refuges or sites of quiet resistance. Luia grew older too. Time laid fine tracks into her hands, but did not blunt the ache of absence. She never found Elisa. The question of the child's fate stayed indefinido. Sometimes a rumor offered a place where a girl had been apprenticed in another house. Sometimes a stranger brought a tale of a child who had been raised by a merchant on a distant road. None of these stories turned into certainty. The lack of closure kept Elisa's name tender and necessary. To say that name again and again was a practice that needed no court sanction. In her last years, Luia rose early and walked to the edge of the Quilombo where cane met untended field. She would sit and let sun warm the small scar on her wrist from a rope she had once used to tie bundles in haste. Children toddled by and asked about the world, and she answered often with the simple truth: "We are not things, we are people." That sentence, repeated in 100 contexts, worked like a stitch across generations. If you had asked Luia whether the crossing was right, she would have hesitated. She would say that the night had been a poem of contradiction, a desperate measure that had exposed a cruelty and required a heavy payment. She would tell you she lived with the consequences, good and bad, and that living with them had been its own moral curriculum. She kept the frasco until her hands could no longer manage the pouch. Then she gave it to a young woman whose child's name she had learned. "Keep this," she said, "so you remember what we traded for speech." The frasco moved through hands and seasons, sometimes kept in a trunk with a scrap of embroidered cloth, sometimes put on a shelf at a market stall to be seen by travellers who might carry the tale away. It became a rumour of its own. People said it contained a tincture that had healed, and other people said it was only coloured water, and both stories were true in their way. It had been part medicine, part message. Decades later, Luia sat under an old tree by the river and thumbed an embroidered hem that had once been Elisa's. The hem had been kept by mothers and passed down. The stitches were uneven, the thread coarse, but the fabric held a name. She closed her eyes and let the wind take the sound of her voice as she said simply, "Elisa." The word in her mouth felt like a small raft on a wide river, fragile, but capable of bearing weight. In the villages beyond, people still told the tale of the night the Senhora was led through the Senzala in low, varying tones. Some told it to frighten children into obedience, some told it to teach bravery, some told it as history. Each telling altered the shape slightly, and the small changes were themselves a part of the story's life. It slipped into songs, and then out again into quieter conversations. Wherever it landed, it nudged the way people imagined the boundary between property and person. If you listen to the old ones now, they will tell you that the crossing changed the sound of the market and the tone of sermons for a while, and that in the long run it made small acts of attention more likely. They will also tell you that no single act undoes a system, that the death of a child cannot always be righted by publicity, that memory is work and must be practiced. Luia died with a name on her lips and a song at her throat. At her bedside, the younger women held sacks of seed and bits of cloth, and children hovered near, learning to touch and name. They wrapped her hands and asked if she had any regrets. She shook her head slowly. "Only that we could not have kept them all," she said. "Only that some things were taken before we were ready. But we spoke their names. We did not let them become a number." Her last breath was not a triumph, but a small human exhale. Afterward, those who had loved her folded her in a blanket and carried her to a place where the river ran near, and the wind could speak to the cane. They said her name, and then they sang the lullaby that held Elisa, along with other names in its ever-turning chorus. The story did not end there. Stories rarely do. It continued in children's lunches and in market gossip, and in the way a priest might clear his throat in the pulpit and think of a child denied care. It continued in the quiet work of the quilombo, where elders taught the next generation how to keep names stitched into hems. It continued in the gossip of the town, where people sometimes paused before pronouncing value upon a life. If this story has left you with a weight in your chest, if the image of a mother carrying a small bottle and a greater burden moved something in you, take it outward. Leave one word in the comments: memory, justice, anger, compassion, whatever this tale wakes in you. Share the story, and let the names keep crossing the spaces that sought to fold them away.